the northern and southern constellations until 36 forms or 36 emanational currents could be recognized. It was all heaven moving in upon man, supplying him constantly with energies. It was man's concept that when his material life was finished, he would return again to the sky from which he came. He must first, however, pass through a kind of purging in purgatory, or a place of darkness underneath the earth. He went down into the earth, but his spirit returned to the stars, and beyond the stars, into the mysterious heavenly world, which was the magnificent counterpart of the lowly earth that we know. This forms a kind of study in anatomy, the anatomy of the universe. And in the researches that we carry on relating to these subjects, we become increasingly aware that all this fitted together to give us a great religious idea, a religious concept that was to remain and be restated through practically every faith of mankind. So let us try and examine for a little while the development of the concept of the mysteries, as these mysteries depended upon the constellational diffusion. We told you something last week about the precession of the equinoxes, and how the great religions and faiths of the world were influenced by the sun's crossing over, or the passing over of the sun at the vernal equinox. This is part of our story, but there is very much more to it. So let us try and follow for a few minutes some of the symbolism that will help us in connection with this. We all know the labors of Hercules. We also know the partial story repeated of these labors in the story of Samson. We are aware of the story of the 12 adventures or voyages of Sinbad the Sailor. All of these have to do with the same type of cosmological symbolism. This mysterious 12 returns again in the 12 prophets, the 12 patriarchs, and the judges that judged over Israel. They come back again in the jewels of the breastplate of the high priest, the loaves of the shewbread. They come again in the circle of the 12 disciples, and in all of the different groups that we have. Wherever the astronomical symbolism impresses itself upon religion, we find the revival of three numbers of great importance: 12, 7, and 4. These numbers always return because they are the great astronomical numbers. If then we assume that the world moves around this great circle, which was the golden or yellow road of the sun in the ancient Chinese philosophy, we see life proceeding in this way. We find also that in this pattern, a solar system such as ours must be part of a constellational diffusion. The ancients said that our sun is a small star in the tail of one of the fishes of Pisces. Therefore, that we belong to a being or a group of beings called blessed souls, and that we are therefore ourselves one of the 12 hierarchies. That the lords or powers of the 12 signs were referred to as hierarchs. The hierarchs, for example, of Capricorn were the archangels. The hierarchs of Aquarius were the angels. And the hierarchs of Pisces are humanity. Humanity, therefore, is a divine being, a hierarchy. And this divine being is one of the 12 orders of life, supported by the zodiac, as we find it encircling the empyrean. Now you might say that this zodiac encircles many suns, and is made up of an infinite number of suns. So we come to a fine point that was rather carefully worked out by the ancients. This is true. Every star that forms part of the zodiacal mystery, and even those not directly within the band of the zodiac, belong in some mysterious way to these 12 hierarchs. But they are related to the zodiac in different perspectives and in different relationships. Actually, we are in the constellation of Pisces, although we do not know it. Therefore, each of the stars within a certain constellation has a certain polarization. And another star within the constellation of Aquarius has a different polarization. And as a result of that, its relation to all the other signs is different. Consequently, actually, in this great family of planets and stars, there are no two alike. Each one is in a different relationship to all the others. And each one is passing through a great cycle of growth according to the laws governing its own constellational body. For this constellational body is a superior being within which a group of suns exist and have their being. All these divisions were charted and mapped for the ancients in order to give us some concept of the magnitude of the world in which we live. Man being of the sign of the fishes, the constellation of Pisces, becomes the dominant note in connection with him. And therefore, as this was the hierarch of the blessed souls, it indicates that within this constellation, regardless of the particular sun involved with its attendant planets, there is a certain kind of growth going on, a growth unique to this particular world, to this particular sphere of growth and development. And this growth is the kind of growth that we call evolution. The fact that man and all creatures known to man must attain by a kind of growing distinguishes the hierarchy to which they belong. Man must therefore evolve, releasing from within himself by a sequence of patterns and laws the potentials locked within himself. Man is therefore placed in a world of self-improvement, a world of becoming, a world which was not known to the angels, a world that was never experienced by the archangels, because their orders of growth are different from our own. Their way of unfolding is entirely and totally dissimilar. We are therefore this strange world in which we must earn our bread with the sweat of our brow. We belong in a merit system that is peculiar to us. We belong also to a particular type of being which has within itself this great problem of ultimate assimilation. Pisces, or the sign of the fishes, is the end or the last sign of the great zodiacal band. Therefore, it is the sign which has to do with the gathering up of all other signs and all that has gone before. It is a sign that has to do with the fruition of previous labor. It is the sign which precedes the sleep or the rest of the gods. Therefore, it is the sign of the old and the end. It is the sign of things having reached destination, having completed arcs and cycles of purpose. And in this we find man living under the strange principle of retributional law, a law peculiar to his hierarchy, and a law which he must fulfill. Man, therefore, of all creatures, is most strongly and profoundly affected by these laws of karma, of destiny, because they belong to the constellation to which he is a part. And all life growing in that constellation grows by the laws he grows by. But a different group grows under an entirely different pattern of laws. Also, man has another quality derived from this hierarchy, and that is the great compassional factor, the great priesthood. For in a strange way, the sign of the fishes is the sign of priesthood. For it also has to do with that part of the solar system from which the new cycle is to be born. Therefore, that which goes to sleep at the end of humanity becomes the beginning of a new birth in time, a new organization, because it is the end of an old, the binding up of a cycle, the completion of things, the paying of debt, the compensation for all things unfinished, and finally, out of this total completeness comes the engendering of a new order of life, a new way of life. So that in a wonderful way, this sign represents the way of spiritual rebirth into another sphere or another plane of action. The ancients had all these keywords and all these keys and codes by means of which they identified the activities and powers of the different constellational groups. And each star had its way of life, and each constellation had its laws and its governors, and the principles by which it was eternally modified or eternally advanced in its own destiny. This brings us to another concept in ancient astronomical symbolism, namely that space is full of mind, that all of these great sovereign bodies are mental entities as well as spiritual beings. They are mental energies because the ancients were convinced that the suns were alive, that they were not merely masses of energy, but they were the bodies of blessed gods. And we find this so beautifully told to us in the Emperor Julian's oration to the sovereign sun. These suns, these great centers of life everywhere in space, were conscious, rational beings. It was only in comparatively recent times that man came into the conviction that he lived in a world in which he was conscious and other things were unconscious. Ancient man believed that he possessed a minimum of consciousness, and that these greater beings around him were far more conscious and far more luminous and far more aware than himself. Man could not understand these beings, but they could understand him. Therefore, the great central suns were centers of understanding and therefore of benevolence. And each sun was a being with a spiritual integrity, a rational power of penetration and judgment, and an active principle of generation. These powers operating together meant that these great beings were actually creatures, tremendous, inconceivable creatures, yet at the same time, like all creatures, possessing sentient powers, possessing a kind of self-knowledge and a knowledge of other things, as man possesses these faculties to a more limited degree. Thus there was a sidereal population of rational gods, of great beings, children of the great and superior one from which they all came. And these, like the elders of Revelation, bowed down in adoration before the throne, the great blazing mystery of the invisible sun, which was at the root of life. Thus everything was astronomical. Everything had to do with the setting up of formal thrones by means of which the wonders of nature could be made manifest. Now the opposite extremity of this vast pageantry was what we call Earth. And Earth was a very strange thing also, because Earth was not, as we consider it, something substantial beneath our feet. The ancients were well aware that Earth as an element was floating in the midst of a diffusion of life, that Earth was a little island upon the surface of the sea of life, that Earth and all other earthy things were conditions, not essentially places nor times, but kinds of life. And Earth was to them a privation of active principles. Earth was the negative pole of heaven. Earth was the infinite receptivity into which all things of a dynamic were forever flowing. Earth was like a vessel that captured life into itself. Man's body was of earth. Therefore it was likewise a vessel which contained and captured within itself the life of heaven. All earthly things were therefore shadows, symbols, negative extensions of life, not absolutely deficient in life, but deprived of it in some way or part. Thus what we like to think of as matter was merely a temporary condition in this great mystery of life itself. But the ancient also had the realization that this matter, which was the source of body, which was the source of this strange prison world in which man finds himself, that this matter as a polarization was absolutely essential to the kind of life that man has to live. Ancient man differed from modern man in another particular. Ancient man had a wonderful acceptance. Ancient man never questioned the validity or the rightness of things. He accepted that which the gods bestowed. It was his power and privilege to obey, to fulfill, not to doubt. So it never occurred to him in his older days that the earth was bad, or that matter had any bearing upon materialism. He never conceived of materialism as we know it, where materialism is simply a kind of worshipping of matter, whereas ancient man worshipped light and the sun and space and the gods. But if we have become a little inclined to develop a matter fixation, it is simply because in our way of life, matter is the only thing that we can see, and only things composed of some kind of matter or containing material elements are visible to us. Pure life, pure intelligence, pure love are not visible to us, except when we clothe them in some material symbol by which they become recognizable, either through their attributes or through their propensities. But matter itself, which is body, the beginning of all bodily conditions, is a receptacle which receives into itself the life and light of heaven, as into another kind of earth. And from this earth the light bursts forth again through the seed, and all things grow upward from matter towards the life which is their common source. So we have elements. Elements not only on our earth, but elements throughout space. For space everywhere is polarized. And wherever in space there is this matter pole existing, it is part of matter. Therefore matter has nothing to do with our solar system primarily or our earth primarily. It is a condition that exists wherever life moves out into activity, because it represents the receptivity which must receive that activity. And without polarization, life cannot manifest itself. And the moment it is polarized, it becomes life and matter. So matter is the infinite challenge, that which must ultimately be filled with life, and must ultimately again return to life. Now matter produces out of its own mysteries bodies. And bodies themselves cannot exist merely out of matter. Matter is the substance, but there must always be the sculptor. Matter is the clay for the pot, but there must always be a potter to mold the clay. So matter extends on and on through space, visible and invisible actually, for its subtler parts still transcend our perception. But matter goes on and on and on. It is a tremendous material from which we can build almost anything, but it remains simply a great expanse of potential. In order that this matter shall become activated, shall have the power to produce out of itself something, or to be molded or made into something, there must arise between space and matter an intermediate power. And this intermediate power the ancients called mind. And mind was the beginning of the principle of form. For mind is the power which, molding matter, organizes it into form. Therefore, wherever mind operates upon matter, there is form. And both mind and matter disappear in the form. And there is a new compound or a new substance that seems to appear. And this new substance is a species or a kind of life. For minerals, plants, animals, men, supermen, deities are compounds of mind and matter. And wherever these compounds arise, we have the emergence of tangible, growing, unfolding forms of life. The molding of matter by mind makes many wonders possible to us. So the ancients interposed between the firmament of the fixed stars, the great spiritual agency, and the elements of the earth, earth, fire, air, and water, the primordial elements which they knew. Between these two they placed the mysterious septenarial hierarchy of mind, and they formed this mind out of the mystery of the seven planets. And this mind became, by its original power, the thinker, by its reactional power, the reflector. And therefore, by the will of mind, by the creative action of mind, things are generated and formed. But by the reflective power of mind, things are regenerated and reformed. And when mind reaches the point in its development in which it moves from generation to, we might say, regeneration, when it passes from the conquest of matter to the revelation of itself through matter, it then moves into a level which we call psychic. And the soul is the regenerating, redeeming, transmuting power which arises from the reflective attributes of mind. So the ancients had their seven planets, which formed the rational focus. These seven planets gradually developed into the seven powers of the human mind, represented and throned in the seven parts of the brain, even as the seven powers of the spirit are located in the septenarial division of the heart. The mind, therefore, with its seven powers, became a second kind of creator, known as the demiurgus, or the God who creates formal things, who become the gradual formators of the world that we know. These were the Ammonian artificers who gouged out holes in space in Egyptian philosophy and made them into worlds. So mind becomes sort of the master of matter. It becomes the skillful artisan, the tubal cain, the worker with fires. It becomes the power of ornamenting and glorifying. It is the builder, which causes to be built out of matter this mysterious symbolical form of the everlasting house of Solomon the king. So it is mind that organizes matter and builds it into a great palace, into a great temple, in which the God of ages is to be enshrined, is to find his material sanctuary among men. This power of mind is variously represented in ancient philosophy. But I think that we consider, in most cases, that this power of mind is particularly centered in the egoism of man. It is this power of mind by which man ultimately discovered his own identity, his own self-existence. And by establishing his own self-existence, he made the discovery that he was somewhere between heaven and earth. He had outgrown the earth, but he had not yet reached heaven. And he conceived, therefore, of a ladder uniting heaven and earth. The same ladder, or the type of ladder that we find in the story of Jacob and his dream. This ladder was one upon which living beings ascend and descend. This ladder was the orbits of the seven planets that extended upward from the surface of the earth to the inner surface of the firmament, or the empyrean. And these seven orbits were the abodes of seven cosmocrators, or deities of creation. They were the ones who molded matter. They were the tyrants, the gods of old. They were the jealous gods of ancient nations and races. They were the ones that, moving about the earth, sought and accomplished the organization of the earth. Among them, according to the Olympian hierarchy, the parts of the world were divided and distributed. They were given their kingdoms, their temples, their sanctuaries. From them, the ancient Hindus say, came forth the continents and the races and the nations, each under the rulership of its own particular deity. But these deities in themselves simply represent the specializations of the seven powers of the mind, moving relentlessly but magnificently, ultimately to become the seven powers of the soul. Now this transformation of these seven as first appearing, focusing their energies upon matter to produce creation, and finally becoming seven doors through which creation escapes back into a spiritual state. This strange difference, the descending and ascending powers of these planetary arcs or arches, are represented through the involutionary and evolutionary motions of energy. So in the initiation rites of ancient man, we find this set forth in such symbolism as the hymn of the robe of glory. We see man as a spirit, man as a divine being, a part of God. We find him descending in some systems voluntarily and in others involuntarily, but always that he is descending through the seven orbits of the planets, as he descended through the royal arches of Enoch, to come finally to the earth, and there to go to sleep in matter, and there to remain asleep for a certain time, and finally to awaken from this sleep as an infant, to pass through the seven ages which constitute physical life, and the seven stages which represent the 7 degrees of spiritual evolution. We find, therefore, that these levels or stages or degrees are related to the 7 churches which are in Asia, and the 7 golden rungs of the ladder that fell from heaven so that Muhammad could ascend through the gates of the Empyrean. Man, then, has this sevenfold mystery within himself. He is ascending through 7 stages of consciousness, and he is returning gradually to the Empyrean, or to the heavenly state from which he came. He ascends through his own growth, through his own discipline, and through the perfections of arts and sciences, for every labor that he performs is part of this septenary. Every degree of growth which he attains is part of it. His evolution through races, his evolution through religions, cultures, through great epics in history, all these turn back upon the septenary, and all parts can be measured and determined by the 7 levels of the soul, by which it ascends to the light from which it came. These are the 7 souls of the ancient Gnostic doctrine and of the Egyptian teaching about immortality. So we have man as a creature passing through an initiation ritual. He descends to the 7 orbits, becomes locked in the abode of darkness, and then from darkness he reemerges. And in your doctrine of Neoplatonism, you find the 7 steps of consciousness ascending from opinion through sense to knowledge and finally upward to illumination, which is again the perfection of the psychic life in man. Incidentally, and by all these points, it is curious that in the evolutionary process, it is not the personal life of man, but the psychic life which must be saved. It is not the individuality, but the universality in man which is important. And this must be brought ultimately and finally to its total liberation. So we have these orders of ancient planets. And we go back to our Greek system, and we find several things that are of great interest to us. In the Greek theology, for example, we find that originally the great God was called Heaven. And this God was called the Great Father God. And he was Uranus, the sky deity. And this sky deity ruled supreme for a great period of time. And then his kingdom was taken from him by Saturn. And Saturn in turn lost his kingdom to Zeus. And Zeus, in order to save his kingdom and to make possible its ultimate regeneration, fashioned in a mystery and carried in a golden thigh bone the mysterious infant child Zagreus, or Dionysus, who was to be the radiant personification of the God himself. This deity, Dionysus, was for the salvation of the world. Now let us see what this all means when we start to develop it. We see then that heaven, Uranus, losing its kingdom to Saturn, is the beginning of generation. This means the first orbit within the great mystery of the sky itself. Saturn was the ancient one, the old god, Cronus, and for some mysterious reason the ancient named the outer orbit of the solar system in honor of this deity, placed the symbol of Saturn as the sign of the ancient one, Cronus or time, and made this god the devourer of his own children. And Saturn, in order to preserve his kingdom, destroyed his children by eating them as rapidly as they were born. But finally, the wife of Saturn substituted a stone for one of the children, and this deceiving the god, Zeus was permitted to live, and Zeus in due time took over the kingdom of his father and fulfilled the ancient prophecy that was written in space. The legend here is rather obvious. Saturn is time. Time devours its own children. It devours everything which is engendered within it. Nothing that is born in time or of time can survive time. Therefore, we have here a problem in substitution. By a subterfuge, something that was timeless was introduced into the pattern of time, and in this way, Saturn was outwitted to produce out of itself or from itself the deity Zeus or Jupiter. Now let us go for a moment and remember that our ancients were not concerned with mere physical phenomena. What did Saturn represent? Saturn represented to the ancients supreme wisdom. Saturn was the ancient power that must ultimately also devour everything less than itself. Therefore, all things that are born from wisdom must ultimately be devoured again by wisdom. This was the strange, abstract, contemplative wisdom of meditation. This was meditation from which things are born, but to which all things must return again. This was a kind of consciousness which engenders, but holding and possessing, always forces the thing which it has created to return to itself again and be dissolved. So Saturn, representing the beginning of creation, also becomes the symbol of death. For everything that is created must die. And everything that is born of the race of the Volsung in the Nordic mysteries is destined to the tragedy of the Götterdämmerung. All the heroes of the world must die because they are the progeny of death. So anciently Saturn, or Cronus, was represented carrying the scythe of death, sometimes represented as the reaper, and often as an aged person, often as a skeleton. Saturn was then the devourer, the ultimate. Saturn was the beginning of motions which in themselves must end. Saturn was the beginning of separation, which is itself the supreme illusion, and must lead ultimately to the end of its own existence. So Saturn plays many parts, often apparently in complete conflict with themselves, but always there is one underlying principle underneath, and that principle is that Saturn is strangely both beginning and end. Saturn is the hope and the end of hope. Saturn is death, and Saturn is everlasting life, depending upon the direction of the motion. For the ancients believed that from the rings of Saturn, souls were cast back into the empyrean or space. Saturn is the graveyard of all things, but it is destined, according to the Chinese, that all the earth shall someday be a graveyard. Everything that is mortal comes under the power of this Saturnian principle that is the absolute tyrant. And yet, by another mystery, one child escaped the destruction. One child could not be devoured by the gods. And what was the symbol of this child? Why did Zeus survive? This is a very interesting and knotty problem in Greek philosophy and Greek metaphysics. But it seems that Saturn gave birth out of himself to one principle that could defeat himself. And the nature of this principle we have to find in the very processes of contemplation. For in the meditational mystery, there is in the state of illumination that power which can escape death, the power that is born of death but comes to eternal life. There is in the composition of all things that which is born but cannot die. This mystery is the mystery of the soul itself. For the soul is the only thing that has a beginning in time, but an eternity of continuance. Such was the Greek concept, inasmuch as the soul, outgrowing the mystery of life, was alone capable of the experience of immortality. Zeus survived the strategy to destroy him, and in time became the master of the kingdom. Now Zeus at this stage represents the infantile aspect of the soul in its, we will say, in its potential, not in its potency. And Zeus becomes a kind of autocrat. Zeus becomes a very tyrannical thing, because he is the symbol of imagination, and because he has to do with the dream of creation. And from Zeus, in his dreaming and in his mysterying, there come forth certain principles and powers. And one of these principles or powers is the horn Zagreus, which is carried within his father's thigh, the mother Semele having been destroyed by thunderbolts. And this horned deity is Mars. Now Mars, therefore, is the next in our order of descending planetary orbits from the sun, from the sphere of Saturn. And Zagreus in turn is Mars, or the dynamic energy of the Titans, or the titanic powers which force the world into existence. And the power of Mars is the power of will. Therefore, out of the experience, out of the mystery of imagination, out of the creative potency of Zeus, comes the symbol of will. Will as the directing force by means of which worlds are brought into manifestation and by which the objective life of man is maintained. But this Zagreus passes through a metamorphosis, because will in itself is a very subtle thing, as Schopenhauer points out. And out of the mystery of will comes the alternative deity. For from Zagreus comes forth Dionysus. And this change is accomplished without death or without the changing of personality. Zagreus simply becomes Dionysus. And the